And then when I got to do my own show, and what was great was when you're the only black person on television, you get away with murder, and you had Barbadian people. I saw you on television the other night. When are you going to do some people from Barbados? I sent the boy down for a roti. He come back with a mango. You get the Nigerian saying that the accent you did the other day was not correct. I need to skill you in some, I'd get told off by all the different types of black people in Britain because I wasn't representing them properly. And the Jamaican women just wanted me to rub my hands with moisturizer. I couldn't believe you was on television last night and you couldn't put even a little bit of cream on your hand them. I had a lot of stick and it was just me.
Welcome to the SAG-AFTRA Foundation's Conversations at Home program. I'm Jazz Tangcay, Senior Artists Editor from Variety. If you are interested in programming like this from the SAG-AFTRA Foundation, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce to many Brits, Lenny Henry is a comedian who we have grown up with. He is, as I've said, a comedian, an actor, he's done theatre, and he's made his mark on British television and the entire population of the UK. In 2015, he was knighted for his services for drama and charity. He's also been appointed a commander of the Order of the British Empire. He is a national treasure, and you can currently hear him in Netflix's The Sandman as the voice of Martin Tenbones, and you can see him on Amazon Prime's show Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power as Sadok Burrows. Please welcome actor, comedian, singer, TV presenter, writer, and a national treasure to us all, Sir Lenny Henry.
That's a very nice introduction, Jazz. Thank you very much. The check's in the post. Do they even that anymore? Do they even send checks in the post anymore?
You're going to have to Venmo me. I'll give you my Venmo info afterwards.
Venmo, yeah. I'll need your back's details.
All right, we'll do that. So as I was saying, you are a national treasure to the, and I feel like Americans are just getting this slice of you, happy to share you with the success of The Sandman, Lord of the Rings. They might have remembered seeing you in Harry Potter. But how does that feel?
Can I just say I was a shrunken head in Harry Potter and nobody's going to remember that. And it's interesting because it's such a big Harry Potter. I get letters for autographs from all over the world. And you think they're going to get that Denzel Washington picture, but no, it's always the shrunken head prop from Harry Potter. Please sign this, Mr. Henry. I am a big fan. It's just not good. But I'll take it from wherever it comes from, strangely. I don't underestimate having a career. It's weird being around this long, and it's lovely that people respond to the work.
Soon that headshot's going to start changing. Soon they'll be sending you pics of Sadok Burrows, I feel.
I don't even know what's worse. Isn't that worse? The big white hair, the ears. Isn't that the worst look? I don't know. I'm juggling between the shrunken head and Sadok. Although at least Sadok's humanoid, albeit 3 feet tall.
We are going to be talking about that transformation later because the transformation stories are amazing. But let's go back because you have had an incredible career for decades. I mean, when did you realize that this could be a career for you? I mean, you started when you were 16, right? Really, but just as a young boy, this is what you wanted to do.
We used to have a talent competition in Britain called New Faces. And when you went on it, you didn't get a new face, but you did get 3 minutes to prove your worth, whether you were a great singer or a comedian or an impressionist or whatever. And sort of the year before, in 1974, I went on an audition. I played hooky from school. I put my Sunday school clothes on, black and white stripy top, black trousers, shiny old school Clark shoes. And I went to a nightclub in Birmingham. And it was a really horrible nightclub, sticky floor, smelt of cigarette smoke. And I got there at 10 o'clock in the morning and I was with this guy who'd said he was going to be my manager. His name was Mike. And he was a DJ and he'd seen me doing impersonations of Muhammad Ali and various people like that in a nightclub. And he thought I should take this audition. So I was with him. And I went in at 10 o'clock in the morning. And it was where I fell in love with show business. There were singers, there were dancers, there were fire eaters, there were people with dogs doing weird stuff. There were show bands, there were kind of jugglers. And I just thought, this is my tribe. I had a tribe. The Jamaican family who were descended from Africans who'd come to Britain in the 50s. But showbiz really was my proper tribe. And I looked around and I thought, this is home. Because I'd always felt a bit of an outrider in my family. I was the one who remembered jokes. I was the one who could do impersonations of people. I'm the greatest. I'm so fast. Thanks very much for the audition. You know, I was very much into doing impressions of people. And my family just went, why is Len talking to himself again? Why does he keep doing John Lennon? Why doesn't he eat his food? You know, they were asking me questions like that all the time. So I was kind of different to them. So when I got to this place in Birmingham, I thought, this is great. They kept me waiting there all day. And what was great about that was, when you're an act, I think an actor called Small told me this. He said, if somebody really good is on, you should stay in the room and watch them. You shouldn't be scared and run out of the room and hide in the toilet. Stay in the room, watch them, absorb their energy. So I spent all day absorbing all this energy from all these performers. And when I got onto that stage at 5 o'clock, I was like, I just exploded and I got a standing ovation. And it's the first standing ovation I've ever got. And it was the most wonderful moment in the world. And I literally got a gold ticket, like in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, that said I was going to be on New Faces the next year. And then when I got home at about 6:30, my mum was waiting on the doorstep like this. And she said, where you been? You haven't been at school. They called me. I said, I went to an audition. What kind of an audition? I went for an audition for New Faces. New Faces? What New Faces? It's a television show. It's a talent show. It's on a side. I know what it is. What you was doing on New Faces. I did an audition. I did impressions. And she made me do the whole thing again on the front doorstep. She was the only thing that stood between me, rice, peas, and chicken. And she wasn't letting me in the house until I did all of those impressions again. And the neighbors were looking through the window, watching me going, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and I hope I passed the audition. I am the greatest. All of that stuff. They watched me doing that for 10 minutes, and then she let me in and have my chicken rice and dumplings. And it was the best thing in the world because she understood that I'd been through something. She understood that my life was about to change, probably better than I did. And then the year later, I went on New Faces and I won. And at the end of the program, when the cameras were on me during the end credits, I waved at my mom and I said, hello, Mom. And I think her heart went, and she realized that our lives had changed.
Yeah. Does she approve of you wanting to be a comedian? Or does she want you to be something else? Like, talk about.
If you can't be it, you can't. If you can't see it, you can't be it, you know. We watched television in our family. We watched Dad's Army. We watched Julia, Mission Impossible. We watched all of those shows. And there were very few Black people, Diane Carroll, I guess, and the guy who used to push Mark Ironside around, Mark, and Lieutenant Uhuru. These were the only Black people on television back in the day. And we loved that. And when they came on television, we'd ring people and say, Lieutenant Uhuru's on again and she's wearing the short skirt. We'd ring people. But there was nobody telling jokes on British television that looked like me. There was a guy called Charlie Williams who came along slightly later, but he told slightly self-deprecating jokes against himself, which made me think, oh, that's the kind of jokes I've got to do if I've got to have a successful career. So in the first part of my show business career, I did jokes that were against myself. But in like the end of the 70s, I stopped doing that because I thought, I don't want to be that guy telling those jokes about myself. I want to be more of a positive force in the industry. And my parents literally had no idea about show business. It was something that happened to white people way over there. It wasn't something that happened to Jamaican people who were the children of factory workers. But secretly in my heart of hearts, I had this feeling because I could make my friends squirt beer out of their nose. And I thought, that's a good thing to be able to do, either nostril. And I thought, if I can make my friends do that, surely I can make other people do that. And then I got up in a discotheque one night after the Commodores. Oh, she's our brick. After Brick House, I got up on stage and I did an impression of Elvis Presley singing Jailhouse Rock, but really wobbly. I used to call it wobbly Elvis. I didn't tell anybody else, but it was kind of a real, really, really, Austin Butler better look out. But it was real kind of, it was real like that. And they laughed. And they were all my peers. They were all my age as well at this disco. Nobody was supposed to be in this club, but we were all there. We were all under 16. I think most of us were doing our homework at the bar. But they watched me and they gave me a big round of applause and they made me feel like I could do something. You just need this much encouragement in the business. And once I'd been encouraged like that, I thought, okay, I'm going to give it a go. And I was very shy, but my friend said, you can do this. You can. It's so great when you've got people who back you. You can do this. And I think that's the same if you're starting out or if you're a middle executive in a company where you feel like you've hit a glass ceiling. You just need one person to say, do you know what? I think you're really good at your job and you deserve to get a leg up. That's all you're looking for is a leg up. So I got a leg up in front of 16 million people when I did New Faces. And my life didn't stop from that moment on.
Wow. And then you had a few other gigs and appearances, but then, the thing that really cemented you into like, certainly for me, my first memory was Tiswas. And I I looked at the year that ran from like 78 till 81, right? Ish.
Yeah, I was into Tiswas is a children's show, and Tiswas is an acronym for those of you watching who don't understand. It's for Today is Saturday, Watch and Smile. And it was a children's television show, but it wasn't for children, really. Children were in it, and there were cartoons like Bugs Bunny, but it was pretty much for teenagers, students, policemen, nurses, doctors, lots of grown-up people. 54% of the audience were grown-ups. And it was if you try and explain Tiswas to millennials now, it's virtually, a man used to pull children up by their ears and interrogate them about where they came from and who their parents were. A man with a dog up, with his hand up a dog's bum, would spit. Every time he said the name Spit, which is the dog's name, the dog would spit. That was the joke. A woman called Sally James would wear hot pants and thigh boots and low-cut tops. This is something for the dads on a Saturday morning. And then every so often, Chris Tarrant, the presenter, would run across to a cage that was full of doctors, nurses, students, lawyers, and he would throw buckets of cold water all over these people. And he would do this several times in a morning with live electric cables everywhere. It was like Guantanamo Bay, but with Bugs Bunny. It was an extraordinary thing. And I was in that program from 78 to 81. And I learned so much about being on live television. I learned about having idiot boards, very handy. I learned about trying to remember things. I learned about jokes, structuring what I was doing on television. I learned about not relying so much on scripts, how to improvise. And I learned to have a really good time. These guys were my friends, and we were like a little family for 5 years or so. And it was a lot of custard pies made with shaving foam that if you inhaled when it hit you in the face, you might die. And this would happen at least 3 times every series. I woke up many times with, some boy band standing around me going, is he dead? It was literally like that every Saturday. But my mom went on Tiswas several times, and it was brilliant. It was a lovely experience to have. And it gave me a good jump off point into the rest of my career.
Yeah. And the next jumping point, I guess, was you hosting the Lenny Henry show on the BBC in 1984. I mean, as you said, there were things that were flying back then, jokes and everything that probably wouldn't fly today. I mean, did you have restrictions? Like, did the heads at the BBC say, here's your show, you can't do this? And talk about what you learned or what you took from Tiswas into this show and how you evolved or how you were evolving.
Well, I did a show with Tracy Ullman after Tiswas called 3 of a Kind. There was myself, David Copperfield, and Tracy Ullman. And it used to be called 6 of a Kind, but the BBC thought, if they get famous on series 2, we're going to have to pay them 3 times as much. That's too many wage packets. So they cut it down. And it was myself and David who they liked. And they said, you guys got to find a girl. And the producer sent us to the Royal Court Theatre to see Tracy Ullman in a play called 4 in a Million. And in that play, Tracy sang, she danced, she did voices. It was like watching Meryl Streep, but from Slough. She was extraordinary. And David and I looked at each other and said, it's her, let's get her. So she came on board, and for the first time working with a proper actress who'd worked with Mike Leigh and Les Blair, I really got a sense of how to utilize my own family and friends to make characters. Because before that, I'd been an impressionist. But once I met Tracy, I started to experiment with voices and wigs and costumes and figure out my own characters. And because Tracy would just stand there and go, right, well, my sister's like this, and my mum's like this, and I saw this guy having a wee in an alleyway, and he was like this. And Tracy just brought characters in every day. It was literally like having a firework going off in front of you. And I started to think, well, what can I do for my family? And I had this guy called Early who used to deliver, there's a guy who used to deliver bun. In Jamaican culture, there's a bun that you can get. It's a twisted bun, and it has no yeast in it. It's called hard dough bread. And the guy who delivered that on a Friday was called Earl. And he used to come to our house and go, you ready? And they used to have bun as well, which we used to eat with processed cheese, not real cheese. Yeah, it had to be processed cheese. So I thought this was a funny guy. And I made him into a tribute to Richard Pryor's Mudbone. And Mudbone is a very old African-American, probably was a slave, and he remembered everything about Black experience in America. And I thought there should be a British alternative to that. And so I had this character called Deacus, who was a very old man who used to go, good, my name is Deacus. I come from Jamaica in a boat. And I had to time the pauses. And I had Guinness. And in the pauses, I would drink some Guinness. It was real Guinness. It wasn't fake Guinness. And I would slightly be wobbly after I'd finished Deacus. They used to have signs in all the windows in the bed and breakfast, no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. So if you were a black Irish wolfhound, you were in real trouble. So we had quite progressive jokes in Three of a Kind that were about the Black experience in Britain. And then we came up with a character called Delbert Wilkins, who was a DJ from Brixton. And this is in 1981. And I'm telling you this because some of these characters went on to the Lenny Henry show. And they hadn't really seen characters like this on British television before. They were used to people saying, you know, if you don't laugh, I'll come and move in next door to you. So that was the kind of joke Black comedians told before. But Delbert had been through the Brixton riots, and he was an articulate young man who'd been stopped and searched by the police a lot. So he would say things like, so I'm driving down the street in my Ford Wicked, yeah. I hear the sirens behind me, yeah. I pull in, right? He comes up to me. He put his head through the window, which worried me because it was still wound up at the time. He said, can you identify yourself? I looked in the mirror. I said, that's me. You know, Delbert had jokes like that. He would mess with the police. And they'd literally never seen a character, a Black person on television doing jokes that were messing with the police and having a go back. And it was like progress. I know it seems small now, but in 1981, it was massive. And then when I got to do my own show, because Tracy went off to do Girls on Top with French and Saunders and Ruby Wax, I wanted to continue this thing of creating characters that were mine, that were not impressions. And I still did Break, Wind and Fire and Eddie Grant and Michael Jackson. I'm getting thinner, thinner now. You know, I still did those things and Tina Turner and things like that. But I wanted to do characters that were mine. And what was great was when you're the only Black person on television, you get away with murder. You know, and you had Barbadian people. I saw you on television the other night. When are you going to do some people from Barbados? I send the boy down for a roti. He come back with a mango. You get the Nigerian saying that the accent you did the other day was not correct. I need to skill you in some, you know, I'd get told off by all the different types of Black people in Britain because I wasn't representing them properly. And the Jamaican women just wanted me to rub my hands with moisture. I couldn't believe you was on television last night and you couldn't put even a little bit of cream on your hand them. When you was doing Tina Turner, you should have creamed your legs first and at least shaved them. And they'd also criticize you if you put weight on in between the series. I had Jamaican people say, why, your bottom get big this season. You need to lose some weight. You put on weight. You could play basketball on that backside. You know, I had a lot of stick and it was just me. When Trevor McDonald, the Black Newsreader, came along, it was great. I could split some of this, but it was me for a very long time.
Yeah. I love that you mentioned that, you know, like there was nobody else and it was you and it was huge. I mean, we didn't have social media and you got to speak to people, but I mean, like, just back, like, what does that mean to you that, you know, you opened the door for so many comedians that came after you, especially like, you know, on British TV?
It was a long
like
time.
Your impact.
It was a long time. It was I had a television series every year from 1976 through till 2005, my own show, you know, whether it was a remake of Good Times, you know, I played the Jimmy Walker part in Good Times. We had a show here called The Fosters. I was in Tiswas, Three of a Kind, Lenny Henry show, and that had different iterations right up until 2005. And the upcoming black comedians kind of said, the only way we're going to get our own show is if Lenny Henry dies, because it was like I had it on lock. I didn't have it on lock. I could have been fired any time. But I worked very, very hard on that show. You know, I was in a room kind of with very wonderful allies. I had a lot of white writers. There were no black writers, I was told. And there was my brother, who was very funny, who could also write. But there were no black writers. So it was just me. So I would come into the room and explode and create, and then somebody would go away and write. And my contribution at times was diminished because I didn't sit down with a pen and a pad and write things down. It was very tough. And a lot of black comics felt that they never got their shot because I had the kind of catbird seat for a long time. But when I was doing my show in different time zones, I managed to get people on my show. So I got, you know, I got Chris Tummings from No Problem. I got lots of people on the show, Curtis Walker. I got the Three Non-Blondes on. I got Miss Jocelyn on. I got lots of different types of people to come on the show and represent. But the BBC were basically not letting anybody else in. So it was kind of a relief. In 2010, when I stopped doing my show, because I wanted to act and I wanted to do serious drama, then what's happened now is the door has opened a bit. We got Jeannie Ashray, who's moved to America, who does Baba Loves Abishola. We've got Mo Gilligan now, who's got 3 shows on British television. We've got, you know, the Hit List with Marvin and his wife. We've got Judy Love doing documentaries and being really funny. We've got Darren Harriott. There's a lot of young black talent coming up now doing comedy on British television. And I salute that. I salute them because it's about time.
Yeah, I love that. 1985, you started Comic Relief, which has grown, and it did so much, you know, and thank you for starting that and doing that. Talk about the genesis of that and bringing this idea into the world and the cause behind it all.
Comic Relief came about because of Richard Curtis. I was there at the beginning, so I'm in there. I'm a co-founder. But Richard Curtis had been to Ethiopia because Michael Burke, who's a very renowned broadcaster in Britain, as you know, went on the news and basically reported back from what was happening in terms of refugees and famine. It was the pictures we're used to seeing if we grew up in this country, as far as terrible African famine in Biafra, in Ethiopia, wherever. The one that triggered Live Aid was possibly one of the worst ever things we'd ever seen on British television. It affected a lot of kids. A lot of kids contributed from school and wanted to help. And Richard went to Ethiopia just because he's that guy. He's that guy who would fly on his own dime and look at what was going on to see what he could do. Now, Richard is connected up the wazoo. He knows people. And when he came back from Africa, he basically told me that he'd been in a room where people were dead. He'd been in another room where people were half dead. And he'd been in another room where people might survive. And when he asked the doctors what he could possibly do, they said, "Are you a doctor?" And he said, "No." And they said, "Well, bugger off and find a way to bring us some doctors then, and medical equipment and medicine and cars and trucks and blankets. That's what we need. So if you can help us facilitate that, thank you. But we don't need you in here because we're working." So he came back to the UK. And Rowan Atkinson was doing a show at the Shaftesbury Theatre. And he said to Rowan, "Could we do a benefit and raise money for charity?" And they'd already started talking about Comic Relief because Richard was working with this project called charity projects with a woman called Jane Tewson. So it was already doing stuff. After Live Aid, actually, there was a moment when David Bowie, I think, said, comedians couldn't do this. And I think it made a lot of us vexed. We all went, because comics have been raising money for Amnesty and for, all kinds of charities for years. But Live Aid, I guess, was a big statement, a big splashy global statement. And it did a lot of good. Bob Geldof did a lot of good. But Richard went to Ethiopia, having seen these extraordinary documentary scenes on the news on the BBC, because he wanted to know for himself what it was like. And he wanted to figure out what we could do. And he came back and he said, we're going to do a benefit. Let's do a benefit and raise some money. And we did that. And Alan Yentob made a documentary about the whole evening, because Richard and I wrote to a lot of comedians to take part in the benefit. And a lot of them were a bit funny about it, because if you say you're going to help a charity that is going to facilitate money for people who are starving and need help and need medicine, for some people, particularly establishment people, it can feel like they are nailing their political colours to the mast. So a lot of the older, more established comedians didn't want to be involved with comic relief because they felt it was a bit political. But what was great was all the younger ones said, yeah, well, Billy Connolly came on, and Jasper Carrott and French and Saunders and Victoria Wood and Neil Innes, and all of these people came on board and said, well, we'll do it. And it was very successful. It was on BBC Two, it was on an arena documentary, and we raised about £15 million, the first one. And then I think we had a party at my house, and I think Richard was saying, well, what are we going to do? And I think I was a bit drunk and said, it should be a whole evening. It should just be like a couple of hours. And lo and behold, Richard said afterwards, that's a really good idea. And we had Red Nose Day. Red Nose Day was going to be a day of topsy-turvy land, where everybody wears a red suit or wears their clothes backwards or says "wibble" at the end of a sentence, or goes to school and sits in a bath full of tomatoes, or has custard in their Wellington boots. This was a day of madness, and you get sponsored for something and you raise money for this charity. And it was an extraordinary thing. And the first show we did raised 15 million. The second one raised about the same. The third one did 24 million. And then it just gathered momentum until a couple of years ago at the London Palladium, we announced that we'd raised over £1.5 billion for charities in the third world and in the UK. And it was a mind-blowing experience to know that the British public and everybody else who contributed their time and their efforts, to know that these people had done this extraordinary thing and saved a lot of lives in the process. So it began with Richard's initial thought. And then when I was brought on board, because I had my own TV show and knew a lot of people, I was able to write letters that Richard would help me to figure out and write to everybody in showbiz and say, please be involved with this. And they did. They got involved. So
amazing. Okay, I'm going to skip a few years. Talk about your first Hollywood experience and what it was like. Coming to America.
I didn't make that movie. Eddie made that. Eddie's the reason I came to America in the first place, because I've been to America and I really love American comedians. Steve Martin, Richard Pryor was a hero. I loved Chris Rock, but my favorite was Richard Pryor. But I loved Eddie as well, especially in the leather suit. I always wondered how he managed his, anyway. But I was a big fan. And I made a film called Live and Unleashed, which got shown at Cannes and also made its own money back in the first British stand-up comedy film by a black comedian in Britain. And we went to the Cannes Film Festival, and a Disney executive saw it and said, "Oh, that guy could replace Eddie and try Identity," because Eddie didn't want to do the movie. I think he just realized that he was the most expensive film actor in the world at that moment. He just made $1 billion for some movie or other, and he didn't need to do True Identity because the script wasn't as good as the scripts he was used to now. So he dropped out. That English guy could take Eddie's place, and it'd be a lot cheaper. So they rang me and said, "We saw you in Cannes, and we're going to pay you this money, and you should come and do this movie." And it was going to be an Eddie movie, but Eddie can't do it anymore, and you'd be perfect. And all I heard after, do you want to be in a Hollywood movie with your name above the title was la, 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 la. I'm going to marry Halle Berry. That's all I could remember. So my wife and I read the script, and I asked Richard Curtis, who by then had made, several television series and was my friend. Richard read it and did notes. And his big note was, perhaps they should replace you and get Hugh Grant to do that instead, which I kind of bedoinged back at him. I got out there thinking that we'd do the changes that we'd all suggested and we'd just make the film. Oh, no. I arrived at the airport. I got a new script. I got to the hotel. I was given another script, a rewrite. I got to the room. There was a new script slipped under the door. For the first meeting before I met the executives, when I got in the car, the driver gave me another rewrite. When I arrived at Disney, I was given, these guys were just rewriting the script all the time. So clearly there was a problem, but I was still la, 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 la. I'm going to marry Halle Berry and maybe Beyonce too. I was still in that mode and I wasn't thinking. I was just so happy to be in Hollywood and Disney. And I went to Disney and the first thing they said was, boy, you got to lose weight. I was in the best shape of my life. Boy, you got to lose weight. They gave me this diet sheet and God bless them. They were I was about 15 stone. I don't know what that is in pounds or whatever, but I was in the best shape I've been since I was 15. Jamaican women were looking at me in the street and going, well, you look good. For the first time in a while, you look good. Your bottom gone down. But when I got to LA, you're a little big. We're going to need you to lose a few pounds. The screen puts like 40 pounds. You're going to need to slim that. It was that. So I was a bit felt a bit, oh, okay. Felt a bit less than. Nobody's fault, my fault. But I was suddenly in this diet thing. They gave me a Disney diet sheet. On one side, it said, you can eat a rice cake 3 times a day, maybe some noodles, pasta, glass of wine, occasionally another rice cake. On the other side of the paper, everything else you can't have. And it just said, you can't have nothing else. You can't eat anything delicious. You just eat the 3 rice cakes and a glass of wine. So that's what I was doing. And I had a trainer called Doug who was huge, literally like a condom full of hazelnuts. The guy was huge, muscles on his muscles. He was ripped and he had a tiny, tiny head. And he used to say to me every day, hey, Lenny, you know what I had for supper last night? And I would go, I don't know, a bowl of steroids. And it was just an impossible situation. I was riding a bike 4 hours a day. I was going to the gym twice a day. And I was kind of doing the Canadian, I'm not even Canadian, the Canadian Air Force exercises. And then I was going to work. So it was a lot of pressure. And they kept changing the script. And interestingly, I think one of the reasons Disney wanted to make it was because they didn't really have a black director. There was Robert Townsend doing Hollywood Shuffle. There was Julie Dash, who'd just done brilliant Daughters of the Dust. Spike Lee doing, She's Got to Have It. Disney didn't have that because there was a small group of people making headlines in the trade magazines, young black filmmakers changing Hollywood. Spike's kind of the only one who's lasted. But Disney went, we want one of those. And they got Charles Lane. Charles Lane is a brilliant filmmaker, but he made silent movies. Charles had never worked with people who spoke. He was like a black Chaplin. He was wonderful and talented, but he'd never worked with a sound man, and he'd never done a big $15 million movie, which is what True Identity was. So there were problems. So wiser heads than mine would have foreseen problems, but I was still, I'm going to marry Diane Carroll and Gladys Knight and maybe the Clips too. I was that guy. So we got to make the movie. And the thing is, True Identity is about an African-American actor called Miles Pope, who is on his way home from Miami on a plane, and he gets upgraded to first class, and he sits next to a very kind of sinister-looking guy who is traveling as a businessman, but it turns out that he's a gangster, played by brilliant Frank Langella. And when the plane gets turbulence, this guy holds onto Miles's wrist, and he starts to confess all the terrible things he's done. He's had people rubbed out. He's stolen money. He's robbed people blind. He's killed people. He's tortured people. He basically spills his guts about everything he's done wrong, about running a crew. And then the plane levels out and doesn't crash. This guy thought he was going to die. And so he confessed all his sins. And now the plane doesn't crash. So now he's looking at this black guy going, oh, you got to go. So when we arrive at the airport, Miles just runs. And he's being chased by these bad guys. And he gets away. And his best friend, played by Charles Lane, the director, who very handily has written himself apart, is called Dwayne. And his best friend says, well, you know what you got to do? You got to pretend to be a white guy. And he makes me up with prosthetics to look like a white guy. And for 2/3 of the movie, I'm a white guy. The first 21 days, I was only ever the white guy. The first day I showed up as Miles, the black guy, I was stopped by security. Lie down on the floor, put your hands behind your back. I'm Lenny Henry. Don't be stupid. He's a white guy. So it was an extraordinary experience. And the prosthetics took a long time. And I knew that it was going to happen because I'd already been Steve Martin. Norma Hill, who's a brilliant makeup artist, used prosthetics to turn me into, thank you very much. Excuse me. And it worked really well. Steve Martin left a message on my answer phone that lasted about 25 minutes saying how good it was. So I knew I could do this role. And we had the guys who did the prosthetics for Dick Tracy, Caglioni and Drexler. We had Michelle, who did the nose for Cyrano de Bergerac. We had Norma, who'd made me into Steve Martin. The guy who did the makeup for The Exorcist came to look at me and see if he could make my head spin round. You know, all of these people put all this effort into making me look like a white guy. And so the effort was good, but it was really funny because there were no black executives on this show. So all of these white executives would come in the makeup trailer and go, he doesn't look like my son. And then they'd ruffle my hair and say, I wish his hair looked more like my brother's hair. And then they'd leave the makeup trailer and we'd just be like, but it was a really good experience and it didn't do very well. In fact, David Katzenberg, the boss of Disney at the time, said, well, it's not going to do good. It's going to be okay, but at least you'll know what to ask for next time. And that was it. That was my Disney experience. And it was an extraordinary experience. And I learned a lot of things. I learned that if you want to make things happen, you perhaps need to have a bit more autonomy, take more responsibility, really, really interrogate the script. And do not think you're going to be marrying Rihanna and Gladys Knight and the Pips. Put the work first. And, you know, huge tribute to my wife at the time, Dawn, who was very supportive of me out there. And all my friends, there were a lot of expats out there, like Jeff Lynne from ELO and Clementon Lefrene, who were brilliant writers, and George Harrison and John Cleese and Eric Idle and Robbie Coltrane and Hugh Laurie and Stephen Fry showed up. And they were all very supportive to me, but I just couldn't, it wasn't mine. So I couldn't do the things that needed to be done. So when I came home, I formed a production company called Crucial Films, and I made my own damn TV programs. And that was a big life changer for me.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I guess the motivation was you coming home and starting a production company. Like, talk about that and being able to tell the stories that you wanted to tell, especially like, you know, we're now moving into, you know, what the 90s and 2000s. Like,
well, I'd had bearing in mind, even though I'd gone off to do True Identity, I'd just finished making the Lenny Henry show and Live and Unleashed, and Melvin Bragg did a South Bank show about me. And I went to America, to New York City, and I performed at Catch a Rising Star, and which was at the time the most hallowed piece of stand-up comedy real estate in New York. And I got a standing ovation at Catch a Rising Star. So the feeling was, oh, Lenny's going to do well. But I wanted to be somewhere where people knew me and where I could nominate the writers and I could work with directors who knew me. Because one of the problems, I think, was that they didn't really know who I was and what I was capable of. And I'm capable of much more than just pretending to be people. You know, I can act and I can do voices and I can do all of that stuff. But I didn't feel like they pressed the button in my head that made the light bulb come on over my head. So when I got back home, I thought, production company, work with writers you want to work with, do something that's going to push you. So when I was in LA, I've been reading about British chefs and chefs were misbehaving in a terrible way in the early 90s. You know, chefs were ordering people out of their restaurant for ordering salt without tasting the food. Chefs were beating up customers and critics. Chefs were doing all kinds of things. If you hung your handbag on the back of your chair, chefs would tell you off. And I thought this was funny. Chefs were behaving like rock stars. And so when I came home, I worked with this producer from the BBC because I wanted to create a television series about a very imperious chef called Gareth Blackstock, who is the self-proclaimed best chef in Britain. And I met this guy called Peter Tilbury, who'd worked with Lawrence and Morris, and he worked on Good Night, Sweetheart and Birds of a Feather. And he created a series called Shelley, and he's a foodie. And he loved the idea of doing a series called Chef. And so we created this guy who was a master chef, who was brilliant at his job, but he was flawed in his social life. And basically, man smart, woman smarter. His wife, who was brilliantly played by Caroline Lee Johnson, was always ahead of the curve and would always recommend that he do the smart thing rather than the stupid thing. It's one thing to be able to let loose and shout at people in the kitchen, but when your wife is formidable and has the best ideas, you take those ideas and you make them work for you. So that was basically the premise of Chef, and it was pretty successful. And it was, once again, one of the only TV series in Britain that had been initially shot on film, because I wanted it to look like a movie, like an American old school sitcom that are usually shot by film cameras. So we did that, and it was a nightmare. Film cameramen are very different to TV cameramen. You know, a film cameraman will go, well, we can't do this because there's a light in the way. In the middle of somebody's big aria, in the middle of your most complicated line, he's standing in the wrong place. He's got to do it again. And they'll just talk. they won't wait till the end of the take. They'll just talk. This light's not working for me. So we had to learn how to make Chef with a film crew and get them to shut up. And once we did that, it worked really well. We were nominated for BAFTA. And then I did 3 series of that. And that got me to the end of the 90s. I did another Lenny Henry show that was possibly the blackest show I've ever done. This was a show where I felt like I'd been cut loose. Richard Pryor was my North Star as far as black comedians were concerned. I wanted to do the show that was about stuff that we were going through now. There was still unrest on the streets. Black kids were still being stopped and searched. And the experience was not really being portrayed on television. And because I was a black guy with his own telly, I was able to be that guy who could have that platform. And we only did 1 series of this show, but my wife at the time said, this is the most militant you've ever been on television. And it's good. This is like your SNL. And I think people felt a way about it. I think people felt that it was too black. But I loved it. I loved doing it. I thought it was an extraordinary show. I got to sing with Shaka Khan. Come on. I got to meet Prince because of Shaka Khan. Come and meet Prince on my birthday. I got to do sketches with all kinds of people. I got to be a blaxploitation detective called Nathan Gunn. You know, I love doing that show. And we should have done more, but we didn't, because suddenly I got the opportunity to do a show called Lenny Henry in Pieces, and that was another life changer. We won the Golden Rose of Montreux, and which is a very big, I'd never won a gold in anything. Three of a Kind won the Silver Rose of Montreux and the International Press Prize, but I won the Golden Rose of Montreux on my own, with my own show, new show, Lenny Henry in Pieces, with lots of new characters. The most particular one was Donovan Bogard, who was always after Mrs. Johnson, like Pepe Le Pew. Mrs. Johnson, here's a fine figure of a woman, Mrs. Johnson, you know. And they still send, I mean, you couldn't do this guy now. I mean, he'd be called a predator. But at the time, I thought it was a funny, because I love Pepe Le Pew. So I thought he was that, but you couldn't do it now. Similarly, I used to play a soul singer called Theophilus P. Wilder Beast, who was a soul singer, baby. My name is Theophilus P. Wildebeest. The P stands for penetration. I think you know what I'm talking about. Ladies, you're all pregnant. It was just ridiculous. I'm making a new album of Disney hits. It's called The Lion King. I think you know what I'm talking about. This guy was nuts. You couldn't do that now. And it was supposed to be a parody of all of those soul singers who would hand out flowers to the ladies. Let me just say, yeah. I got a flat. Get up here, girl. It's the guys who handed out flowers and had a bed on stage. It was those guys. And I wanted to satirize that from a very right-on point of view. But in the end, it looked like I was enjoying it too much. Because I was making records and I was singing. Oh, dear. Anyway, I did that for a while.
You were singing with Kate Bush. I
was singing with Kate Bush. I did it on Amnesty International. And it was a thing. Kate Bush saw me do it on Amnesty and just said, come and sing on my album. And I did. And I got a record deal. I got 3 record deals. One of them was Simon Cowell, who said, you can sing. You should have a record deal. None of it came to heart. You know why? Because comedy had bought my mum a house. And Trevor Horn said, this is going to be harder than you think. And I went, okay, you're right. This comedy is paid for my mum's house. My mum literally moved me to the head of the table and put my dad way over there. I was suddenly in the catbird seat, eating the biggest piece of meat. So when you have that as a Caribbean child, you kind of go, game recognizes game. I am not a real singer. I'm pretending and enjoying it way too much. I'm gonna be an actor because that's what I was born to do. And literally in 2010, when I did Othello, it was as if the gods were pointing a big finger and went, hello, you should have been doing this from time, because I had the best experience playing Othello, doing Shakespeare, one of the hardest roles ever. And I worked with a wonderful guy from called Barry Rutter from a theatre company called Northern Broadsides. And he believes that actors should do their own voice. You speak the way you speak and you use your own dialect, your own accent. And I went up there to Leeds, which is in the north of England. And Barry basically said, we're going to do Shakespeare and you're going to work very, very hard. And so I had a dialect coach, I had a Shakespeare coach. I used to go to the gym every day. I worked with Iago. This is rare. I worked with Iago every day on our lines. We did a brilliant read through. There was an extraordinary experience where we all sat around a table with all the actors. Darling, no, you, darling, you're marvelous. No, you're marvelous. Actors are amazing. Cappuccino, latte, I'll get it. No, darling, I'll get it. Actors are terrible. So we all sat around the table and we said, right, Barry said, right, his dad's a fisherman. Let's get on with it. It's not acting as this calling, it's acting as work. We're going to roll our sleeves up and we're going to work. So we read the play. I was very nervous, but we read the play and all the actors at the end of it, we gave ourselves a round of applause. You were marvelous. No, you were marvelous. You were coffee. Shall I get coffee? It was all that. And then Barry Rutter said, all right, thanks for that. Now, when Laurence Olivier did Othello in the late 60s at the National Theatre, apparently he gave a reading at the read-through in front of all the staff and all the cast and all the management at the National Theatre. Olivier's performance at the read-through had such clarity and depth and tragedy and innate humour that at the end of the play, when he finished the read-through, the entire room gave him a round of applause that lasted for 10 minutes. And I'd like to thank Lenny Henry for not putting us through that today. Thanks a lot, Barry. We've got some work to do. So we've really worked hard on the play. And when we got to the actual day of the show, I still don't remember what happened. I remember taking some aspirin and then going on stage. And it was like that. And then I was taking my bow at the end. I don't know what happened in the middle. I think the critics came expecting a car crash. Comedian thinks he can do Shakespeare was going to be the headline. And oh my God, the reviews, some people had cavils with some of the verse speaking. Some people found it a bit odd to have Lenny Henry, the guy who said, Katanga, my friends, and on British television doing Othello, but the guy in the Telegraph gave it a 5-star review and said stuff about my acting. And I was nominated for Best Newcomer for the Evening Standard Awards, and I was 50. And I just thought, this is like a sign. And I thought, for the first time in my life, maybe I should listen to this. And so I've persevered with the acting since, and I did Comedy of Errors at the National Theatre. I did Fences and won a Best Actor award for Fences. So these are the gods going, hello, keep doing this. This is a thing for you. You know, we love you doing the comedy, but this is the thing. So I've basically been an actor for real since 2010. And I've done acting before in sketches and with Robbie Coltrane and with, you know, Alan Cumming and with various people. But this was the first time I felt like this was the real deal. And it's, you know, I guess doing Fences and Comedy of Errors and Educating Rita and all those plays was my acting school, the steepest of learning curves. Because if you've never trained, every time you walk into a rehearsal room, you're the new kid with your rucksack on the back, with your mum's sugar sandwiches in the rucksack, thinking, I hope they like me. And you just got to put the work in. My mum had 5 jobs, my dad had 6 jobs. Jamaicans are used to working hard. And so I just had to apply myself in the way that my mum would apply herself and hope that it works. And thankfully, I'm touching wood here, it does kind of work. So hooray. Hooray for the gods.
I love that. I'm just curious, before that, had you ever been offered theatre, or was that lots what made you say yes then, this time?
Because I felt that I'd reached a point in my career as a comedian where I was flirting with acting, but I needed more tools in my kit than I had. I'd never trained. You know, a lot of actors do 4 years like a university. I'd never done that. I'd worked with, you know, I did Bernard and the Genie. I did Alive and Kicking with Robbie Coltrane. I did White Goods with Ian McShane. I'd done acting on television, but I'd never done a play. And I just felt a bit incomplete. I did a TV series about an idealistic school teacher. This was around the time my mum was sick. And she would die kind of in the second year of this TV series. But I was working with, you know, Richard Griffiths and people like that. And I was working really hard, but there was something missing. And a brilliant film editor on that show called Brian said, let me show you something. And he showed me 2 scenes. One scene was me lecturing to some school kids and standing on a desk and saying, you gotta throw yourself into your education. This is your big moment. It was a real kind of my captain moment. And you could see that I was incredibly invested in this moment, in this scene. And then he showed me a walking to the car moment. And he said, what's the difference between the 2 scenes I've shown you? And I said, the scene where I'm standing on the desk, I have a proper intention and I know what I'm doing. I know why I'm standing on the desk, and I know why I'm encouraging, I'm facilitating, and I'm pushing these kids to be the best that they can be. The walking to the car and talking to this lady scene, something in me is just thinking, oh, this is just a walking to the car scene, and let's get it over with. And this guy said to me, you need to treat the walking to the car scene the way you treat that scene. Invest yourself in every scene like it's really important, and you'll see your film acting improve 110%. And he was right. So for me, every day on a film set was like school from then on. I wanted to know everything about hitting your marks, about being in your light, about when to project your voice, when to speak quietly, when it was okay to speak quietly, about when you moved your arms around. You know, you could probably do that in a wide shot, but not so much in a close-up, you know, all of those things. And I got to work with wonderful people who would encourage me. Richard Griffiths was a great friend, and he said things like, you know, if you're having trouble learning your lines, write them out. So I began writing out my lines just to get a sense of, pretend I was writing the lines, and then they would go in my head. So the next day I'd walk on the set, because I'd been writing them out all night, suddenly these lines would come out. So I learned a lot doing that series. But the thing that made me do Othello was that Barry Rutter came down from the Halifax to do a radio show with me called "What's So Great About Shakespeare." Talk about hubris, because I'm from a working class area of called the Black Country in the Midlands, and Shakespeare, although Shakespeare was from Stratford upon Avon, which is down the road, it didn't feel like Shakespeare was for us. Shakespeare felt like it was for middle class people who were educated. It didn't feel like it was for us. But Barry Rutter, as I said before, was the first person who said, Shakespeare's for everybody. We all own Shakespeare. Shakespeare's literature. Whether you're black, white, gay, straight, whatever, Shakespeare's for all of us. And he came down to BBC Radio, and we ran the final scene in Othello, Softju, a word or two before you go. I have done the state some service, and they note. We did that maybe 40 times. And we were being taped doing it with Simon Elms producing it. And at the end of it, I felt that from the first time I did it to the 40th time, that there'd been a massive improvement in the performance. And I said to Barry, am I going mad? Did that get better? And he said, yeah. And I said, do you think I could do this? And he went, of course you could bloody do it, lad. And then the next thing you know, I'm walking down the street in Leeds and there's a big picture of me, bare-chested, with Lenny Henry is Othello written on it. And then my journey began. So it's down to Barry.
Those are amazing reviews. I'm going to skip. I'm going to jump up to Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power, because I want to make sure we talk about.
You need to skip. You can't get all this in.
I have to skip, exactly. And people can do their research in between. But
you do Wikipedia.
The transformation, I was like, oh my gosh, how do they do that? Sadek is such a great character. Talk about getting this role, working in the pandemic too, because this was shot at the height of the pandemic, and just the reception that, the show has had and your character Sadek has had.
I've never been in a show that's been watched by 25 million people before. My first appearance on British television was seen by 16 million people. And I was in the first all-black sitcom on British television that was watched by 24 million people in 1976. But I would imagine the cumulative viewing figures for The Rings of Power is like 30-something. It's extraordinary numbers. What was amazing was the reaction was split, actually. I think there were a lot of people who were Tolkien fans. Some of the die-hard Tolkien fans were freaked out by the fact that there were going to be black people in it. And what was great was the program makers did not feel that. They just went, it needs to reflect the 21st century, and we need to do storytelling that supports that kind of presentation. So we're going to have elves of color. We're going to have half-wits of color. We're going to have dwarfs of color. And we're going to mix it up. We're going to shake it up. And you know what? If people have got a problem with it, that's their problem. And I really admire the showrunners for doing that. So I get a phone call from my agent and says, we've got a phone call. And I go, do I owe somebody money? No. They want you to be in this thing that's like Lord of the Rings. No, I love Lord of the Rings. There was never any black people in it. Gandalf never hung out in the hood. Bilbo never had a Cadillac. But I love Lord of the Rings because it's just one of my go-to texts from when I was a kid. I've read all the books. I read The Hobbit. I know the Lord of the Rings. And I think this is a moment, if they're asking me, something's happened. So my girlfriend set up my iPad on some books and my phone on some other books. And I did this script that was never in the end product of the show. It was just a script that the showrunners put together for me to audition. And I did it. And I thought, well, I'll never hear from them again. And they rang up the next week and said, you're doing it. And it was like, what? It was amazing. And I got flown to New Zealand and I was in this hotel. And the first time I went, there was no pandemic. So it was great. And there were no scripts. So it was like a mystery. What's going to happen? Does my is my character going to survive after episode 2? How's he going to speak? And then they said, oh, well, you guys are going to be Irish. And I was like, okay, what? You're going to be Irish? Irish? Well, that's all right, because there's Irish people in Britain. And actually, my brother is married to a lovely Irish lady called Eileen. I might need a dialect coach because, I'm doing a generic Irish accent, and you might need somebody who speaks proper Irish so that I can get it for you. And the great thing was we had a brilliant dialect coach who said, we're going to do a very specific region of Ireland called everywhere. So as long as we sound like this and we're all doing the same thing, it's going to be fine. And people in Ireland, when I went on the Late Late Show last week, they teased me, but they actually said, you know what, you guys did a good job. So hats off to Leith, who was our dialect coach, because I think she did the right thing. But I love the idea of Black Irish people. Phil Lynott was Irish, and I love Phil Lynott. So, we exist. And when I watched it, I thought, this is it. This is going to change, because the fantasy, the sword and sorcery space is tricky, because apart from Grace Jones in Red Sonja and the odd, and, Jimon, the guy who was in Amistad, who, there are very few, Woody Strode in Spartacus. There are very few Black actors who get to represent in that fantasy space. Probably a few, Samuel L. Jackson gets eaten in Jurassic Park, within 20, every Black person in the room go, damn, they couldn't let him get halfway through, but, this is probably the first time we're in that Blade, I guess, Wesley in Blade. So these are people who make it to the end of the show. That's good. Right. We don't just get beamed down to the planet and then get eaten by an alien within the first 10 minutes. So I was really respectful of that. And I know my ultimate end in Rings of Power, and also in the Witcher prequel that I'm in, it's still a 7-league boot progress, I think, in terms of people of color in things. The more we do it, and the more we just do it, and the more producers just go, do you know what, we're just going to do this, the more you'll see change. And people need to know that change is long. And Americans are ahead of us. They're doing this, and they're, can Ava DuVernay have a break? Can Ava just sit down and go, well, I've changed television forever, I'm going to have a cappuccino. She's really in people's faces about change and about women behind the camera and in front of the camera. And I have such respect for her. And she and Oprah and everybody who speaks out about the lack of diversity and inclusion behind the camera, you've got to give them their flowers, because they're changing the industry. And what I've been doing since 2016 is trying to do that for British stuff behind the camera too. I've spoken at Cannes, I've spoken at MIPCOM, I've been at BAFTA talking about ring-fenced money for diverse programs. I went to MIP and suggested that there should be a diversity tax break for films made in Britain that kind of go out of their way to employ a more diverse behind-the-scenes crew. And these things are all things that are being chewed over. Some things have been acted upon. Certainly, if you watch television now, there are more Black and brown and female leads than there were 15 years ago. But there's still a long way to go in terms of behind the scenes. But change is long, and we have to be patient. But we still have to push. We can't take our foot off the pedal. We push and we make change happen. And we've all got to do it together. Otherwise, it will just stop happening. So that's what we're doing.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. And you've also written a young adult book, The Boy with Wings, which does look at the lack of diversity in fantasy. And here you are, you're on this fantasy role right now with, Rings of Power and The Sandman and, The Witcher, and change is happening, right?
We eat cornflakes, we drive cars, we were adept with weapons back in the day. Why aren't we with Conan the Barbarian? Why aren't we fighting vampires? I've been reading comics since I was 8. And the day Wyatt Wingfoot and T'Challa showed up in the Fantastic Four was a red letter day for me. The day the Prowler showed up in Spider-Man was a red letter day for me. the day Blade appeared, the day Black Lightning appeared. These are moments of inclusion in the fantasy space that made a young boy go, hey, I'm going to buy 6 of those and give them to my friends. There's not just a kind of respectful and a kind of a inspirational piece here. There's also a kind of thing of, you're going to sell more comics, you're going to sell more sponsorship streaming subscriptions if you have more diverse characters in your things. And the people behind the scenes, if that's more diverse, they can help you to make those decisions about why. Because the why is important, because it's the right thing to do, because it's the 21st century, because we don't need Mark pushing Ironside around anymore. We don't need Link in the Mod Squad. He was great and he was a precursor to this, but we need characters that have more than one line. We need characters that say more than, Gov, over here. We need characters that have a pivotal role in these things, both in front of the camera and behind. And it's happening. And, when I sit on a Zoom with Amazon, when I go to a meeting with Netflix, when I go to the BBC, I see glimmers of hope. Because back in the day, the only black people at the BBC were the people on the door in security and the women in the canteen. Now we've got a few execs flying around, and that's good.
And writers too. So you go into the writers' room, right?
Yeah. But even that needs, you have to push. When I had a production company called Douglas Road, and you got to deliberately say, we're going to have a room full of writers of color. We're going to write about we're going to write about the Windrush, or we're going to write about Una Marson, who was a black pioneer at the BBC, or we're going to make a documentary about misogynoir with Judy Love. You got to pitch these things, and somebody has to go, yeah, that's a good idea. So we need allies. So it's one thing to demand change, but if there are no allies facilitating that change, we're not going to get anywhere.
Yeah, I love that so much. There's one thing that I would want to talk to you about, because, with the audience is your peer group, you've also done commercial work, and everybody tuning in today or watching this, I would love for you to go and watch Lenny Henry in the premiere in commercials that you did way back when.
Jazz, what's the matter with you? I'm pointing out to people I was in a commercial. I got to get my daughter through school. Yeah, so I've done lots of commercials, actually, and I love working with people like Paul Wayland and Roger Woodburn and Richard Longcrane, all of those actors who've done movies and stuff. They all do commercials. I worked with the guy who lit the George Michael Different Corner video, so you could fanboy out to these people. And also you get to see these directors working with a big train set that they don't get when they work making television shows. These guys don't get to work with the massive movie train set that a film director gets to work with. So you see them showing off. You see them showing off with cameras on a zip wire, or with, a massive 35mm film camera, or with the 40-man crew. It's extraordinary. I mean, nothing is going to be as big as the Power of the Rings crew. I've never seen 300 people on a set before. Nobody worrying about how we're going to feed these people. Just all of them doing vis effects and making sure the perspective's right, and standing there looking at me and saying, do we need the little guy here? Do we need the little guy, or do we need the middle guy? It was brilliant doing Power of the Rings, because money was no object, and it was a kind of a diverse set, and it was inspirational. It made me want to come back and go, I'm going to do it like that. So hooray. Yeah. But thank you for pointing out that I've done some commercials for the last 10 years.
Well, no, I love it, because it was, again, that was part of, you'd watch ITV, Channel 4, Channel 5, and it's also part of your incredible, you've got an amazing work.
You got to own it as well, you got to own it. Own it.
I love it. Talk about getting knighted by the Queen and receiving that honor, and just what it represented for you personally.
I already... I've done several Royal Variety performances for the Queen and for Princess Anne and various people. So I'm on their radar, I guess. I did the Golden Jubilee before. I was one of the hosts on the Golden Jubilee. I'm the guy the Queen came out after Tom Jones to stand on the balcony. So she waited until Tom Jones finished. And then she came out and went and took her place. And then I said, could we all turn to Her Majesty the Queen in the balcony seat? And could we all say to her, as one 250,000 people strong audience, could we all look at the Queen now and say, you just missed Tom Jones? And she laughed at that. She thought that was funny. So I'm on their radar. And I got this thing with Buckingham Palace writing on it that said, we want to give you a knighthood. And I asked everybody, should I do this? I asked my most militant friends, and they said, why wouldn't you do this? Wouldn't your mum be proud of this? And I asked my family, and they all said, you better do that. You know, mum would be off the chain, impressed and proud of you. Because my mum, when I did the Royal Variety performance the first time, I managed to get my mum tickets. And she sat on the same level as the Queen. And she was very close to the Queen. And I'm pretty sure all the way through the show, she was offering the Queen toffees. She was saying, do you want a drink? When I came on, I'm sure I heard my mum say, that's my son. So my mum was a big fan of the royal family. So I just said, I'm going to do this. And it was a big day. You know, my sister Sharon came with me, and my daughter came with me, and my partner Lisa came. And we all drove to Windsor Castle to get the knighthood. And we got stopped on the door by these guys with guns and ID, please. And we all showed our passports. And my sister Sharon had forgotten her ID. And I said, I'm getting knighted today, guys. My sister Sharon's forgotten her ID. I said, I'm so, what can we do? You know, do you want me to go? And he went, oh, Len, you're all right. I love the Premier Inn. And he let me in.
I love that.
He let me in. So Sharon got away with no ID. She could have been a ninja terrorist or something. But the guy let us in. It was amazing. And then, you know, you're very nervous. You walk through Windsor Castle, which is there's lots of military souvenirs, lots of shields and spears and knives and, you know, big swords and stuff. And then you walk through this room that's just priceless art. And then you're waiting with the MBEs and the CBEs and the Knights Companions and the Knights, and you're going to be a knight, and you kind of can't believe it. And then they call your name, and this little lady's there with a sword, and you just think, is it going to be a knife crime or what? But no, she's going to knife you. She's going to knight you. And you kneel down, and actually then you're at the same height as her, so that was nice. And she knights you. And she says, you know, how much has Comic Relief raised so far? And you go, over £1 billion. And she says, well done. And then that's you out of the door. You're finished. And the most amazing thing happened. When I came out, I got a phone call on my mobile from the boss of ITV, who said, I'm so sorry. And I said, why? He said, because we did the story about you getting the knighthood, and instead of a picture of you, we put a picture of Ainsley Harriott up on the screen. And I went, really? Is this a joke? And he said, no. And I went, oh, God. Don't worry, we'll fix it for the 6 o'clock. And he did. He was very, very sorry. And to me, that's what the diversity and inclusion thing is all about. It's about people behind the scenes who would go, well, that's not Lenny Henry. That's Ainsley Harriott. You need to fix that. You can't put that out. It's having people behind the scenes who understand that stuff and respect that stuff and say, well, this is important. And I was mad for a bit, but then I got drunk and it was okay. I got drunk with my family and had a plastic crown on and pretended to be Prince Philip, and everything was fine. And it doesn't get you anywhere. Older people tug forelocks and call you sir, but all the man them, they still call me Uncle Len. Uncle Len. Stormzy calls me Uncle Len. So, you know, I'm just Uncle Len to people now. Not like that. When we had the big party for my family to celebrate, there was a big banner that the kids had made. They said, congratulations to Uncle Sir Len on his knighthood. So to my family, I'm Uncle Sir Len. So that's nice.
Love that. Are you now auditioning for roles in Hollywood? I mean, like, what is that process for you now? Like, do you still have to audition, or is your agent sending you scripts?
The Witcher was a phone call and an offer, actually. That was nice. And Power of the Rings, I had to do a reading and then wait. But a lot of the time, people are asking for me now. They've seen me do theatre, and people like Nina Gold will recommend me for things, which is really nice. So I'm on casting director's radar now. And it took a while. I had an acting agent who said, even though I'd done Othello, to a lot of people, I was still that guy who dressed up as Tina Turner in his sketch show. And you've got to do enough work to get past that. So, I just did Othello and Comedy of Errors and Fences and Arturo Ui and Educating Rita and King Hedley II. And, when you've done some August Wilson, that is like school. So I've put in the craft, I've put in the hours, and I have a process now, and I'm still learning, but I've got a process in how I do things now. So I kind of feel like I've put myself through the ringer to be at this point in my career.
Yeah. And again, many watching this, they would have done theatre. Talk about how that, doing 8 shows a week, how that really, what you took from that into acting moving forward. Like
8 shows a week is hard, man. If you've been a comedian, you got one show and it's like 10 o'clock and you get to have a drink. You can't be drinking and showing up late when you got cast, because it's lovely being around your fellow cast members. One of the things I felt about being in a play was that line of delineation between being on your own as a comedian and having a little family around you. I loved having corridor time with other actors where you're running your lines. I loved making cups of tea for people. I love people making cups of tea for me. I love that moment of, I'm not sure about this. What should we do? Well, let's have some dinner and let's run the lines. I love that. When I did Othello, Conrad Nelson, who played Iago, would train with me every single day and run lines with me after rehearsals every single night. I mean, I was probably spoilt. This was my first acting experience. But actually, that's happened since. I worked with Lashana Lynch, who's brilliant in Woman King. And when we did Educating Rita together, we ate together, we ran lines together. I mean, she knew her lines on day one, by the way. So I had a lot of catching up to do. I thought, we'll have some rehearsals, I'll learn my lines, I'll be off book by week 2. Lashana Lynch knew her lines, and that meant, I've got a week, I better get on with this. She pushed me in ways that I've never been pushed. And then working in the National Theatre was extraordinary, because that was like a big gang show with 30 people. We did this exercise where Dominic Cook, the director, who's now an acclaimed film director, just said, you guys need to know everybody's names. What? 30 of us. I'm bad enough when there's 6 of us. But we stood in this room, this rehearsal room, and we did this memory exercise where, who's on your right? Pete. Who's on your left? Dave. Who's behind you? Pete Earrings. There was 2 Petes. Who's on your... Claudia. So you had to keep turning and knowing who people were. It was amazing. And from that day, we were like a crew. There's the Sopranos, there's the guys from New York, and there's the Comedy of... Let me talk to those Comedy of Errors guys. We were like a crew. We ran together, we ate together, we drank tea together, we partied together. We were those guys who were doing Comedy of Errors at the National. And we were like, what else do you want us to do? You want us to do The Rivals? You want us to do Small Island? Bring it on. We were just ready to do anything. And I think that's the thing. When you're working with a cast of people who are like your tribe, your family, you can get to a point in a play where you can go, well, let's start rehearsing another play. And I know in weekly rep, you do that, 3 shows a day, change your program on Friday or whatever. But we felt like we could be doing weekly rep. And that's the joy of being at the National. Sometimes you are practicing another play during the day, and that's hard work. So that's what that taught me. the discipline of being an actor, never being off sick. I never, as a comedian, you can't be off sick because it's you. You're not going to get paid if you're off sick. But I brought that into the acting thing, and I was surprised a bit. I've got a bit of I'm not coming in tonight. The understudy's on. I was like, are you crazy? If you were doing 15 shows at, Caesar's Palace in Luton, you couldn't be off sick. They'd kill you. So, but I think acting is family. And I don't think I can go back to being on my own anymore.
I love that. Okay, last question. Is there, now that you've done or you're doing fantasy, is there another genre that you're like, I haven't quite done this yet? Hollywood, this is what I want to do next.
I love the fantasy space, and I Neil Gaiman is my friend, so I'm always talking to him. I'm one of the reasons they're doing a Nancy Boys, because Neil Gaiman came to my house one day, and I'm always like, how come? I'm like, you never see black people in like horror, Scatman Crothers in The Shining, okay, but you never see black people in like horror or supernatural stuff. And in Jamaica, we have obeah, we have witchcraft, we have, Haiti, we have like all of that kind of stuff, spiritual stuff, the third world, we know about fantasy. Why can't we be in fantasy things? And Neil Gaiman went, and then he went away and he wrote a Nancy Boys, which I kept reading it and going, this is brilliant. You don't know any black people, don't you? And I had to read a lot of the characters. And I apologize to all the American people to go, well, we own a Nancy too. And Nancy's part of our heritage too. But I did all the characters as Jamaicans. When I did the audiobook, I went, everybody's going to talk like this. And so I did it like that. And I had a lot of fun. But I love when I watch True Blood, and I love when I see somebody that looks like me wielding a sword or flying or shooting laser beams out of his eyes. To me, this is my 8-year-old Lenny. Those are his dreams coming true. And I think long may it continue. And of course, I want to be in The Godfather. Of course, I want to be, you never have the guy saying, well, the asteroid coming to Earth is on this trajectory. That's never a black guy. That's why I thought Samuel L. Jackson might last a bit longer in Jurassic Park. But I want to see characters of color in different situations where you don't expect to see a character of color. It's amusing, but also it's about time. Like Lizzo says, it's about damn time. So let's change it. Let's change it up. More black women, more black men, more gays up in the house. Let's do it. Let's flip it. Let's have everybody be that scientist who comes on and saves the world. Because people have had their turn, and now we need to mix it up.
I love that. It is about time. And Lenny, I have to say thank you so much for that incredible conversation and insight into your incredible career. We only touched on some of it, so there's a lot more work that you've done, and I hope people go out and watch that. And really thank you for sharing your experiences, the craft, your process with your fellow performers.